Hey y'all, it's entry number 11 of this offseason series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Trey Lance, quarterback, San Francisco 49ers. The positives with Trey Lance fantasy profile. Rushing upside. The biggest draw of Trey Lance's fantasy profile is his rushing upside. During the 2021 NFL season, Trey Lance played over 50% of the snaps in just 3 games, according to Pro Football Reference. Week 4 against Seattle, Week 5 against Arizona, and Week 17 against Houston. In those 3 games, Lance carried the ball 31 times for 161 rushing yards, or per game averages of 10.33 carries and 53.67 rushing yards per game. During his college career, Trey Lance carried the ball 192 times for 1,325 rushing yards and 18 rushing touchdowns over the course of 19 games. On a per game basis, this was 10.11 carries for 69.74 rushing yards and 0.95 rushing touchdowns per game. Clearly, he's got massive rushing upside, which can be one of the biggest factors in being a breakout fantasy quarterback. Next up, we gotta talk about the solid receiving weapons on the San Francisco 49ers. The San Francisco 49ers have a pretty solid pass-catching group that includes Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, and George Kittle. By having solid weapons for Trey Lance to throw to, it will make it easier for Lance to put up decent passing numbers. The last thing I really like about Trey Lance's fantasy profile is that he's got a great offensive-minded head coach. The San Francisco 49ers have one of the better offensive-minded coaches in the league, in Kyle Shanahan. Shanahan has worked with quite a few different styles of quarterbacks, and by having a solid offensive play caller helping him out, Trey Lance should be put in a better position than a lot of young quarterbacks. Moving on to some of the concerns in Trey Lance's fantasy profile. Inexperience. It's no secret that Trey Lance is pretty inexperienced compared to most NFL starting quarterbacks. He has just 2 starts and 71 passing attempts under his belt at the NFL level, and at the college level had played in just 19 games and had 318 passing attempts in his career at a college that was in the subdivision level. Throwing under 400 passes combined at the college and NFL levels is not a lot of data to work off of, and it's harder to get a good read of where Trey Lance is at right now skills-wise compared to some of his peers. The other thing we gotta talk about in Trey Lance's fantasy profile is the offensive line changes. The San Francisco 49ers offensive line was the 3rd best in the league last year according to Pro Football Focus. But it's a new year and the line has drastically changed from 2021, with the team only bringing back 2 of their 5 primary starters from 2021, left tackle Trent Williams and right guard Daniel Brunskill. With all the changes from 2021, there's a good chance that this position group as a whole declines a bit in 2022, which is not what you want to hear if you plan on rostering Trey Lance in your fantasy leagues. The third major concern I have with Trey Lance's fantasy profile is just how good is he as a passer. During the 2021 season, Trey Lance completed just 57.7% of his passing attempts. In the 3 games that he played at least 50% of the snaps, his passing yards totals were 157 passing yards against the Seahawks, 192 passing yards against the Cardinals, and 249 passing yards against the Houston Texans, according to fantasy data. While it's important to remember it's only a few games, there's a very real chance that Lance's passing numbers are lower than the league average quarterback in 2022. Some extra thoughts and information that we need to think about with Trey Lance's fantasy profile. In standard fantasy scoring, in the games where Trey Lance played at least 50% of the snaps, Lance scored 20.38 fantasy points against the Seattle Seahawks in Week 4, 14.58 fantasy points against the Arizona Cardinals in Week 5, and 19.06 fantasy points against the Houston Texans in Week 17, according to fantasy data. Will Jimmy Garoppolo still be on the 49ers roster during Week 1? And if so, how does this impact Trey Lance's job security for the 2022 season? Deebo Samuel reportedly wanted to be traded this offseason. Will this issue escalate at all during the rest of the NFL offseason? What impact will losing former offensive coordinator Mike McDaniel have on the 49er offense? Personal opinion, Trey Lance is going off the board as QB 15, about pick 129 overall on ESPN, and QB 15, about pick 117 overall on Yahoo. Doing the research for this entry and learning a little more about some of the situational changes on the Niners, most notably the offensive line, has made me cool off a little bit from going full hype mode about Trey Lance's fantasy potential this year. But having said this, I still think that he's being a little undervalued at his current ADP in fantasy drafts because of his rushing ability. Personally, I would probably put him at QB 10 or so going into the year, but I think that the bottom line is that he probably should be going somewhere in the QB 9 to QB 15 range of drafts based on his combination of inexperience and upside. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Trey Lance started a scholarship for his high school back home in Marshall, Minnesota. Because of that, here's a link to the Pride in the Tiger Foundation, whose focus has been on raising funds to support current and future educational excellence in Marshall's schools. And that's all for today's entry. If you have a player that you'd like to see covered in the video format of the Player Day series, drop a comment below.